Hi, good evening. I'm Sara Kay. Thank you for coming. It's nice to see everyone. I hope you had some moments to see the exhibition before you sat down. If not, there'll be plenty of time afterwards. I'm actually not going to say too much about the show because we have Maya Benton, the curator, here tonight. So I have a great pleasure of introducing our guest speakers. And I'll say it's really exciting for me to have you both here and Maya here because I've, for like the last 20 years, really been on the periphery, if you can call it that, of the photo world. So because of these great projects that Maya is bringing to the gallery, I feel like I'm learning a lot and meeting such great talent. And it's really exciting to discover something new and be so immersed in it after so long of being in the field. So before I formally introduce Maya, I just wanted to say that these shows that we're doing, and this is number 2 of 3, are not only a product of her great curatorial vision, but it's also a product of a 21-year friendship that we have shared. Maya and I met when we were little, and and it's been wonderful to work with her because we watched each other really build our careers. And grow as professionals. So when I walk in every morning, I'm surrounded by her vision, and it's just a really lovely experience. So, but officially, Maya is curator at the International Center of Photography in New York. She has organized numerous international traveling exhibitions, lectures widely, and is a frequent contributor to magazines and museum catalogs. Maya is currently organizing a traveling exhibition of the photographer and filmmaker Gillian Laub and her contemporary images of racial segregation in the American South called Southern Rights. Her next book will be an anthology of seminal texts on Jews and photography. Jason Lazarus is an artist exploring vision and visibility. His works include a range of fluid methodologies, found and appropriated images, text-as-image, animated GIFs, photo-based sculptures, live archives, and public submission repositories, among others. Jason also organizes PDF Objects, an itinerant sculpture text repository, Coco Hunday, an alternative exhibition space in Tampa, Florida, and is the co-founder of Chicago Artist Writers, a platform that invites artists and art workers to write traditional and experimental criticism. Currently, Jason is assistant professor of art and art history at the University of Southern Florida. Brian Wallis is a writer, curator, and historian of photography. Brian is curator for the Walther Collection, New York and and was formerly deputy director and chief curator at the International Center of Photography. He previously worked at the Guggenheim Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, and the New Museum of Contemporary Art. Brian is the author of numerous books, including The Order of Things, Weegee, Murder is My Business, and Miroslav Tichy. How do you pronounce the last name?
That's it.
Tichy? Yeah.
Tichy.
I love the artist, but I forget the last name.
Yeah.
He is the co-editor of the forthcoming volume, Imagining Everyday Life, Engagements with Vernacular Photography. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
You're all here to hear Jason and Brian talk about his incredible installation. So I just wanted to welcome all of you and thank you for coming. We have one of the 5 artists in Expired here, Susan Mikula, and I want to just give you a brief introduction to this exhibition in 1 minute. We're bringing together 5 artists who are engaging with contemporary art through expired photographic materials in 5 radically different ways. So I hope you'll have time to go through this exhibition. One of the artists, and I'm just going to very briefly introduce what we have here, Tony Cairns from London, who uses expired Kindles or e-readers and burns digital ink images into the screen. So the obsolescence of those objects, it's like within 3 or 4 years of their production, they became obsolete. And he takes things that were basically destined for the dustbin and reanimates them. Alison Rossiter takes expired photographic papers and creates these abstract images based on times passing. So I can go through each of these works and I'm happy to talk to you about it later, but I wanted to kind of give you an introduction to the broader overview because you have 5 artists looking at expiration and the materiality and historicity of photographic materials in very different ways. John here takes photo trays. Photo developer trays. And these are objects that were a kind of quotidian object that were central to the production of photography for most of the history of the medium. The one on the bottom right was actually Nell Selkirk's tray that had been given to him by Avedon so that he could print Diane Arbus's photographs after she died. And so you see that these and some of these trays actually were, one's in the Smithsonian and one is in the Kodak Eastman House. These have now become kind of historical objects, but they were quotidian tools. And so it's a way of reanimating something where the original purpose has passed. Similarly, Susan's work, she works with expired Polaroids. We have actually some of the physical Polaroids in the cases, and her cameras, old antique cameras that have been, tried to their limits in 100-degree weather. And she has taken them and photographed using impossible, fugitive, expired Polaroid film and old machines, and bridges, the kind of 60s and 70s or 80s when these materials were meant to be used, and embraces the chance and the challenges of working with materials where you can't predict what the outcome will be. And it's a kind of honoring of the materials and the artifacts in this moment of digital turn, the digital turn where everything is so ephemeral. There's this, I think, instinct in return to looking at objects and artifacts and what you can hold in your hand. So finally I want to get to Jason's work, and Brian and Jason will talk about it in depth, but I've admired Jason Lazarus and his work for more than a decade, although we've only met, a few months ago. So this has been such a great thrill and treat. I learned about his work from Too Hard to Keep, which is a project I'm sure you guys will discuss. But I had seen an installation of recordings at SF MoMA, which they commissioned and acquired. And this is the first time that this body of work is being shown in New York. It's a site-specific installation, as you can see, that takes vernacular photography and reanimates it into what I think is just amazing poetry. So I want to leave this to the two of you to discuss, but I wanted to thank you both. Brian, who is a world expert in vernacular photography, it's such a treat to have him engaging with Jason in his work and bringing it to New York for the first time. I can't imagine a more ideal interlocutor. So thank you both for coming in the midst of APAD, for coming here and getting on a plane to come back for this conversation. It'll be online so that people can appreciate this and start to understand Jason's incredible archive and body of work and how he's taking this something that's no longer, all the things we write on the backs of the photographs and the clues about history and family and narrative, and how those can be reimagined and repurposed into, I think, just beautiful poetry. So I'm excited to hear what you guys have to say about it. And I finally want to thank Sara, my very dear friend, for allowing me to have her space and work with her and collaborate with her. I mean, to have a friend whose work you've admired for 20 years finally have her own gallery with her name on it and have her entrust you with that space is an amazing gift. So Sara, thank you for entrusting me with your gorgeous space and your name. And it's to work with one of your best friends is a dream. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Maya. I also have just met Jason, but I've known about the work for a long time. Very excited to talk about it, think about it, and most importantly, to ask Jason about it in some pointed ways. I was doing some reading about the work, and I read this one review by this critic named Lori Waxman, and she said, Jason Lazarus is still considered a photographer, but not a photographer in any conventional sense of the word, which I thought was a really interesting description. But I don't know whether you took that as complimentary.
A little bit of the text that you read, I do an exercise with my students in Florida. If they have to talk about their work in 140 characters or less, right? Like a tweet. And later they'll have to do like a 750 word statement. So I was trying to think if I could boil down the work that I do. I think like vision and visibility is the tightest, sort of combustible like engine to start off with. And to me, that's the most important thing, is just finding where sort of like surplus energy and meaning is. Mm-hmm. It does become interesting, these questions you're asking, because this comes into it later, but there's like a market component. There's also an academic component, right? Like, how do you become a professor in a photography department, or what does that mean how I might reimagine what a photography department is, which
Is that what you're engaged in doing now?
Well, yeah, in the back of my head. Yeah, so I mean, I always take those, it's a compliment because I think the edge or the margin has been sort of a very fruitful place where some of my best work and discoveries have happened.
But it also, I mean, I thought about the academic side of it too, because in a way you're teaching your audience how to think about photography differently, which is probably the same thing you're doing with your students. Like, let's think about this differently and come at it from a different perspective.
Yeah. I think that's
literally the backside in this case.
Yeah, well, there's like a lot of great steps that happen. I mean, I got my undergrad in marketing from DePaul University. I worked for conceptual theater. I used to see these directors and costume designers and sound designers give these presentations about their research. They were so articulate and committed. And I wanted to do nonprofit marketing for an organization that I thought had sort of like was culturally redeeming in some way, like something that that I wanted to market. And that was when I started to get into photo for fun, and I took night classes. And then later, I found out I barely got into Columbia College, Chicago. And it was there I studied with Daoud Bey, and Barbara Kasten and Paul D'Amato, and had this great mentor who was sort of a philosophy art professor. He taught one class only. His name is Michael Weinstein. He's passed now, but he was also really influential. The point being that in grad school I really learned how to make a project and sort of like what commitment is. So a lot of those steps that came later were, I don't know, thinking like I kind of know what I'm going to see, or maybe that you know, when you get to be a better photographer, you can pre-visualize what's going to happen better. You know, like you can work with color, temperature, and depth of field, and you know, so you just start to, I don't know, get a little bit too good.
So that seemed too easy or something?
It's not.
It seems to me like in your earlier work, you were sort of proceeding by subtraction, like making hurdles for yourself or trying to make it more difficult or more abstract in a way.
Yeah, I think when I was younger, I just had more that I thought I needed to say, and then like getting older, you like listening becomes like trying to become an active listener becomes like a, I don't know, more mature process, right? Like what can I hear around me? Like how is this space talking to me? How are these materials speaking to me? So I think there's this great energy when you're younger and you're like, I want to go like conquer, you know, what does this landscape mean? Or, you know, what is the scene at this roller skating rink, or whatever, you know, whatever your cultural interest is. And as I've gotten older, I also really admire artists who have fun in their work. And I heard Ryan Trecarton say once in a lecture that fun is its own kind of intelligence. And it really, really stuck with me. And so I think maybe something like this comes out of moments where, I don't know, you're just trying to agitate yourself and have moments of delight and maybe feel like you're messing with yourself or things don't feel, like I can't pre-visualize it so easily. Yeah. And you have to adjust more.
But, so I'm thinking of your early work that got a lot of recognition of standing at the grave of Emmett Till. This is a conventional photograph, but a lot of it depended on the title to sort of realize. So it's, I mean, we have no slides, but it's interesting to visualize because it's a virtually empty landscape with a tree, and then you recognize there are some plywood boards over a grave, but really a lot of the empathy and pathos of the experience is in the title.
Yeah, so that was a moment when I got out of grad school. Like my thesis work was me scanning my body on a flatbed scanner. It was very, it was where I learned to like make a body of work and, you know, being pushed to kind of revisit the tool and develop sort of a visual language. And when I got done out of grad school, you know, a lot of artists work from self-portraiture as like a step, especially me coming not from art, right? And it's like you sort of like also just figuring out yourself and your identity. So I kind of hit a wall. I was like, I think at a certain point, I'm just sort of like fetishizing. I'm not discovering anything anymore. And so once I had my thesis show, then I started to make, I very like opened up the rules and I just sort of used different camera formats. There wasn't like, I'm gonna use this camera to make this project, you know, which is like a typical maybe photo strategy. And I started to make some flippant works that were about, you know, what is it to be a contemporary artist? And, you know, like, and I have a picture of myself like walking down the steps of the MCA with a gasoline can in Chicago. That was sort of like a homage to Ed Ruscha's Lacma and Fire from the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, but then, right, so then this Emmett Till moment happened, and I think that was like really earnest, and I was working at a apartment search agency at the time, and it was sort of like I could just sort of leave, and we were only on commission, and I read about this story that Till's grave was being exhumed that day. So on a whim, I sort of went down there, and I made that image, and so I was like kind of trying to fit it that this image, in a way, was a self-portrait, right? And that was like the way I'd been making work newly at that time.
See, that's interesting too, because the title is something like "Standing at the Grave."
Okay,
so
yeah.
It
So you're reminding me something. So I had like all the work at that time was self-portrait as an artist, blank, doing this, doing that. And then it was at that moment that I don't know, I was like, how do I back off? Because I kind of felt like that moment, which the media had left already, and they had a white tent built over the grave plot, and the white tent was so, I thought that's what I was going down there to photograph, because the white tent was so brutally neutral and sort of like just everything that you could think of that was inside that tent that you couldn't see. So I got down there and the tent was gone, but the planks over the plot, like there still really wasn't a lot to see, contextualized by all this insane history. And so, yeah, that was a turning point. I just was like thinking of that as a monumental moment, like that I just wanted to pull in as many people as possible to that moment because I thought it was a shared moment, you know, and everyone else is like working jobs and, you know, doing whatever you need to do to get through the week, and I just was able to sneak out there and make that image. So a lot of the work after that, I don't know, became more serious or like kind of like listening, I don't know, more.
I like the idea of listening, and because there was something about the juxtaposition of that title and this sort of empty image that brought the viewer into that space, and it's not exactly listening, but it's sort of looking with you, which I think is maybe characteristic of a lot of your later work. There's a participatory element that's really interesting. So I was curious how you got from that to the series that Maya mentioned, THTK, which stands for
right, Too Hard to
Too
Keep.
Hard to Keep.
Yeah.
Which is all about, you know, participation and crowdsourcing of vernacular photographs, and thinking about, you know, the powerful impact that photographs have in people's lives. And I love the idea of like something that you can't bear to throw away, but you can't look at it.
Yeah. So because of my, what I thought was like more straight ahead education at Columbia College and becoming more expert through a lot of trial and error, like different formats and all the methodologies, and I started to just really enjoy pictures that were goofy, idiosyncratic, that had light leaks, that the focus was wrong. You know, Anne Golden has this great quote, like images that were born out of love, you know, like she's like, it's an honor to be called a snapshot photographer because, you know, those images are made out of love and, you know, that's like a badge. And so it was like a slow creep, and it kind of came in with sort of, like looking for something different, and again, having that sort of bodily feeling and that joy. And I worked on one small project before, Too Hard to Keep, that kind of set the groundwork. Like it was another, like just collecting around an idea. And then the Too Hard to Keep project idea came to mind, and I sent a few things to friends just to see how they would respond. And then one of the first few images I got was it's kind of like the cousin of that famous Nan Golden image where she's been battered and she's against green, and she has makeup on. And then the friend of mine sent an image post-battered, and like archetypally it was very similar, and I was just...
She has a black eye or something.
Yeah, and I was just like shocked.
Yeah.
Shocked to know that about her all of a sudden, shocked that the idea was sort of, I don't know, setting out a social contract that we weren't signing anything, but that the idea was sort of outlaying a sort of social contract, and that, like, for her, that maybe the return on investment was also good. Like I was just guessing. And so I think it was at that moment that I thought that the submissions were, you know, that there was like a crack that maybe these had places to go. Or, you know, that there was like some archive that was out there. And, you know, I had a relationship where I remember a person said something to the effect of like, oh, I have images of so-and-so hidden under my bed, buried away. And then later we broke up. And so I just feel like there were some like great seeds and like normal developmental trauma that I was just like, you know, it was like the storm cloud, and I was like, okay. So, so then, you know, that project just started to build quickly because, you know, social media was just starting to happen, but like we were all making blogs during those times. So I still have a very
2010 or something.
So I still have like what I like it is sort of a dorky blog. It's 2000 or toohardtokeep.blogspot.com, and I haven't wanted to really do an Instagram or because like I don't want to push it to be like super visible again.
Right.
You know, it's like I don't want to overly pull those images.
The blog idea is interesting because I mean, I'm fascinated by what you're calling the return on the investment, which I take to mean like why these people want to circulate an image that's painful to them.
Right.
Or whether it's cathartic for them to, you know, resolve that pain in some way by sharing it or by giving it to you to hide so that it's not under their bed. You know, what is that equation? Are you not interested?
Oh, well, I think artists, okay, I'm going to try to answer,
Yes.
Artists are always dealing with all sorts of weird economies, right? Like, there's like, it's a hustle economy. And, you know, so when you're trying to like cobble together rent from various sources and you're trying to kind of maintain some interest in the world and kind of keep your ears and eyes and heart like sort of available for small things that are not sort of main economic like goals. I think that there are a lot of poetic economies out there, and I think that was like maybe something I didn't realize till later when I had to like do a lot of like grant writing, and you're trying to summarize your practice, and those are always like painful but really great because you have little breakthroughs. And so yeah, the world is, as everyone knows, very transactional, and social media now being like doing this great like double play where you get to like express yourself, but you're like so elegantly monetized. And so I feel like Too Hard to Keep, you know, it's kind of at the end, like it's basically like a dying project idea because not really anyone had, like not many people have physical photos that are too hard to keep anymore. You know, so when I talk about this project, I think about, you know, that poetic economy was like, I kind of, whatever, got to participate in that in the last, you know, few years. No one young, like it's already kind of.
So it's predicated on hard copy photographs.
Yeah, although people do send me, I'll get texts, like I've published my phone number before and I have an email address that I publish, and so I have like a drive or, you know, an archive, and I just sort of stow them away. I have never made like a slideshow. I don't really know what those could become. I've thought about storing or like exhibiting drives where you never see the stuff. That might be the most elegant solution, but I just feel like I don't really, I sort of like, I open the gate, so because digitally people take me up on it still, I just like keep accepting it and just try to have a couple organizing principles.
And so looking at this archive, is there any coherence to it, or is it just every kind of image you could imagine that for one reason or another people can't?
Okay, so this is great because I wanted to briefly talk about sentiment versus sentimentality, which also comes up with this project, I think, and both projects can become twee or drippy really fast, and I really find that an important line to figure out as an artist, which is, you know, with Too Hard to Keep as a project title, I wanted to be like, the title is its function, like you just get it. I wanted it to move very quickly, and so naming it its function helped that spread quickly, I guess. But I do get a lot of images that are young couples. I mean, there's certain, you know, like images like I don't need to see more of. And it's not personal. Like, I mean, I might look like, you know, I'm sure when I was like in those moments, I looked, you know, so there's a lot of content and it spans, you know, wildly. And then so like this project too, I think it's a matter of finding sort of a degree of coverage, right? Like I only get a few abstract images, but those are really important in the way that they become sort of absorbing and re-radiating information from the images you do see. So I think my job as like an artist, archivist, editor is to rebalance or kind of pull the viewers toward what I think are some of the like kind of most critical and fascinating, I don't know, that they don't extinguish so quickly. So the same thing is here. Like I do have images of, you know, wow, she has long legs, or she said yes, like engagement, like just sort of almost like Americana 50s, 60s. And, you know, when I first get them, they're fun, and then I'm like, this burns very quickly. And so I think when Maya asked me to do this installation, and I started to learn about Maya and Sara and the context, and then there's just kind of like the political context right now, and sort of, you know, like I kind of want to make the least cute and just trying to find ways to, in the installation and find geopolitical arcs that complicate what at the end of the day are very sort of maybe solitary, tender moments, and that those actually grow in meaning when those are recalibrated through the lens of, maybe a number of groups of images that I think, don't burn quickly. And, for some viewers, the project might be too sentimental or not sentimental enough, or, but I think this is distinctive because I made it for New York at this time, and
Yeah.
I guess being a number of years into this way of working, like I never titled this series, at the end of the title it says 2006 through 19, because I've been collecting these for that period of time, right? So, I don't know, it just feels like respecting that sort of like collecting process, which has a lot of chance and idiosyncrasy, and that this is sort of born out of that experience and randomness.
So, this is an interesting question to think about, both in terms of the THTK, but also the recording series is like how much you take into account the context in which these are either received or presented. So if you say that you collected these over 10 years or something like that, but then they come together at a particular moment and you're making an installation in response to a specific political context, that's an interesting, way of thinking about it, because it's not at all obvious, right?
Yeah, and you don't need to make it so overt because abstract paintings are a form of journalism, I think. If you can't find a way to plug yourself into the world and you work inward, and who's to blame you? I don't have agency, you know what I mean? I can't find myself in the world. People find super inward paths, or, that to me is a ripe form of documentary, of journalism, right? Of the interior lives that people just retreat to. Those can be endless and rich. And so, you can make overt political work, but I've also tried to open my mind and sort of asking what counts as a photo, what counts as a documentary, how work ages, where's your best audience? It might not be the ones that are in front of you, or, and to try to be open about actually maybe that there's other meanings that happen accidentally in the work that are come out later. So for example, this is a conversation Maya and I had that when I worked with the Contemporary Jewish Museum, they had an artist and scholar, Dan Schifrin, and he talked about the Jewish tradition of a geniza as sort of a reference point for Too Hard to Keep. And a geniza is where, correct me if I'm wrong, but an Orthodox Judaic practice is that whenever the God's name appears on paper or in a prayer book, you don't throw it away, you sort of elegantly retire it into a geniza, right? So then by virtue of following this law, you might have multi-century spans of material where having the word God was just this, it goes in or it doesn't, right? That's this sort of overt litmus test. But then by virtue of everything that found its way in, right, you have this amazing body of historical knowledge, all these sort of inadvertent narratives, documentaries, photography is funny because it democratizes so many things in front of you. If I made a photo with a snapshot camera, someone's scuff on their shoe would look, as legible as the charm around the neck or the hat that they had on their head. And so, photographers are always wanting to point at things and this is important, that is important. But then, embedded within photography, or like what I like to think about photographic thinking is like it's this sort of hubris that we would even really know what, like that, you know, the way meeting happens, you know. And so of course it's great to have people who have a vision and follow it, but just like the amount of information and the multiplicity of meanings and perspectives, I think is sort of the turn, like that's a turn,
Right.
you know, I don't know.
But then what you seem to be interested in this installation and others is the ways that photography goes even further, and through participation or use, it exceeds even what, you know, we expect from this very all-encompassing informational medium. And so what I love about this installation is, you know, the element that goes beyond, like how people put photography into use in their own everyday lives. Like how they write on it, how they cut them up, how they shape them, how they put them in an album, and how they add to what the photograph provides in terms of meaning. And then what you do is like take all those elements and put them together into a kind of a narrative, which is interesting.
There's a digital corollary to this that I think is worth mentioning here, which is after I started working this way, I worked on a project called Orion over Baghdad, and Flickr was like the sort of online media sort of storing and sharing platform of the time. And so I was going online and looking at the pictures that soldiers who were serving tours of duty were posting, and it was like this amazing other form of journalism that spanned from just, there's a lot of boredom, which was a thread that like it makes sense once I saw it, but like kind of was really alluring, right? Because it's like the anti-decisive moment. And anyways, so I started collecting all the titles, only the text that was in the title field. So there's like a title field and a caption field, and the caption field was, you know, have everyone who was in the photo, but the title field was usually where there was just some like quick riff on what the photo was, and that those ended up being really compact poems that spoke a lot to the history of war photography. And so after I started working this way, that was a little bit of, you know, like I'm 43, and I just think that like one of the things that's possible with an artist who grew up without the internet, right, and started to email for the first time while I was in like late college, right, which now seems really strange teaching, and you know, that sort of that analog to digital paradigm, there's a lot of crisscrossing, right? So this installation, I also think, I like to try to add this to the didactics, that it's also kind of really interesting to think about hashtagging, right? So like what is the digital equivalent of what it is to write on the back of a photograph? And these were very sort of inward and familial and family tree, and it's digital, it's performative and public act. And so you're like publicly sorting, and you know, you might do that through humor and just general, like very simple factual categories, or your ambition, like contemporary art in New York, and you know, you're tagging your own stuff. And so I like to try to, you know, inflect the projects toward, you know, that threshold, just because that's the kind of wonderful dislocation I've had. You know, that could become really, I don't know. It's just like a really interesting time to simultaneously be making work and, you know, studying the history and the contemporary practice, and then trying to teach students, and then being like, what does a freshman beginning photo student really need right now? You know, they can take photos and edit them and publish them to like audiences that were bigger than I ever could when I was in school. So it's kind of like, what are we offering? It's a healthy question to ask, I think.
Yeah, but a lot of what you're talking about centers around a theory of photography rather than the images themselves. In fact, a number of your works deny the image, right? These installations force you to imagine what the reference is to without ever seeing the image. And so, as you're mentioning, a lot of the works either focus on or explicitly foreground the textual supplement to the photograph, which becomes a kind of poetic replacement.
Yeah, I think one thing I've understood is that I don't know. I used this term once and like with SF MoMA, and they were like they were like not happy. But I had the way I like to think about it, and they ended up relenting and letting me put it in the didactic. But it was the photographic imaginary, and like to me, I was just like, yeah, like photography, right beyond the developer trays, and like our day-to-day image making strategies, is just sort of like a much broader field, and I've tried to. That all that negative space is positive space, and that viewers bring sophisticated experiences to the work, and I think that's also maybe a product of getting older and having maybe more multiple or fragmented thoughts about like the information and the images that you get, like, or constant cynicism, or yeah.
Could you say a little bit about how you began to conceptualize an installation like this, and how you choreograph the elements, like in terms of just the materiality of the photographs, or the spacing, or the...
Yeah, so this installation, well, first of all, right, is a result of everything I've learned since 2006, 2007. And what hasn't changed is this seed image idea, which is to say that I try to find an image that to me is like the sort of poetic starting point of the installation. And so I think I came across an image that idiomatically translates to Burying Stalin. It's an image from Stalin's state funeral in 1953. And so thinking about, I don't know, the encounter with an image from a funeral now, and also it just felt like, to me, it became sort of like moved to the foreground of all the kind of images I had at hand, right? So I bought it actually on eBay when I was searching one night, and so it's from Russia. And so like with that image, I have to like kind of recalibrate all of the material, right, that I have at hand. And I was like, I like this image, Burying Stalin. It can also be translated as Stalin is buried, or there's a little bit of wiggle room. And I kind of liked that. Like I like it when the definition isn't 100% clear, depends who you ask. And thinking about like that act of burying Stalin is like, if you just take out the word Stalin, like that becomes sort of like a societal act that's constantly happening, which is, like class struggle, power struggle. And then through my conversations with Maya, learning so much about, even more about like what a photo editor Stalin was and his regime, right? And sort of like rewriting history. And, in the age of like post-truthiness, like no truth at all, I was just like, yeah, this is like right. So you take that image and then you don't put it in the middle, right? And, I then was really interested. I did a lot of searching for images of protest, and so with images of protest, then I had to think or find like 20 images that are either synonyms or sort of strong and weak synonyms for the word protest. And even going through that sort of textual puzzle is really interesting, right? Like how a demonstration, I don't know what words became prevalent in what eras to search for that kind of material.
Well, these were your search terms
These
on
were
eBay to try and find
yeah,
images?
yeah, and I did more eBaying this time because I'm like, I'm just gonna like give myself like 30, 40, 50 search terms, and I kind of had a system of email alerts, so every morning I would kind of go through what came. And you can't really search for what is on the back of this photograph because no one assumes that that's what you're interested in. So there's a lot of like dead alleys, which is fun, and you know, like I was motivated, right, because I had like a deadline and I'm going to New York, and you know, to do a project in New York when you're living in Florida is like extra exciting, right? And so it's, you know, anything for Maya and Sara, right? So, right, and so I had this bearing Stalin. There are a number of images that softly or loudly get at sort of modes of dissent, and then so those are just maybe like half a dozen images in the installation that just become sort of like guardrails for me. Like, okay, this is enough content. And then I was doing sort of rehearsal installations in my garage in Florida. I have a wall that's like kind of maybe 2/3 of this. And that I did that in order to just kind of know, like I wanted to only bring up like maybe my favorite 300-ish photos, because it's so infinite and you just kind of have to like narrow. And then I think maybe by the time I get here, there are images that I thought were fun at first, and then I understand that they are maybe sort of a little bit overly 50s cute, you know, like Americana stuff. And, you know, someone's gonna do an installation like this, but they're just gonna like, I mean, if it hasn't been done already, right? Like in some kind of cool Brooklyn bar, and they'll just go and buy a bunch of images and they'll just wallpaper the whole wall, right? And it's just like what interior designers do, or, you know, they just like invent it and they go out and find stuff, and it's, you know, and so I just sort of like, well, what's my version? Like where's my scholarship? Where's the discipline? You know, how do I create like, I don't know, like how do I feel this material deeply for everyone else who's doing their own things? So the images that I think burn quickly, those get edited out. And then, you know, it becomes also really fun formally. Like I get to go up, make a gesture on the wall and back up like 10 or 15 feet and look at it. And like I'm going through like a painterly physical exercise. And for a photographer, that's so fun and weird. And, you know, I teach in an interdisciplinary program. Like I continue to try to like agitate my own methodologies, and that's like what I'm most interested in. And I think kind of helps bring me back to photography is like just trying to find little antagonistic points.
And how do you see your relation to the viewer in something like this? Because it's like, it's an interesting setup where it's both seductive, the texts are engaging, but then it's frustrating because you can't see the picture. Mm-hmm. And so it opens up these interesting questions about how photography functions.
I think you just want to leave the viewer lingering and thinking about all the images that they have either, you know, like that there is no kind of narrative conclusion, right? And that there is like a new sensitivity to, you know, everyone will talk about like, oh, my grandparents, like that's the first like quick connection people will make, or maybe style of writing. And so, but really it's sort of that lingering idea, like what you said, it's sort of like philosophizing about the medium and like maybe what we don't see, or like backing up a number of steps, and so like leaving a sense about the sort of imaging power and how we might be exhausted in certain kind of images, other ones are available with a shifted point of view. And whenever you have that, you have new modes of sort of knowledge production and history writing, And we're all like everyday history writing all the time, whether it's in social media or the way we're recounting what happened to us that day or week. And so we're all, funny editors of our own lives, like maybe informally, but also to the people we love the most, right? And so they get the sort of tweeted version when you're tired at the end of the night, and that becomes your little documentary of like, no one else is paying attention. So yeah, kind of just getting at bigger modes of history writing and sort of problematizing narratives like after they kind of have their first round of like their more formal like intended meanings.
And so how do you see this work functioning as a photographer and in relation to other things that you've done that don't seem photographic at all, like making protest signs or something like that, which involve participation of other people, unexpected results, and maybe using image making and maybe not?
Yeah, well,
I mean, it gets back to this question of like, not a conventional type of photographer.
Yeah. Well, okay, so one of the ways that I learned the most about the way images work is like looking at issues of social justice, right? So it's so cool because there's just enough people here that like old like collaborators who worked on me with other projects, and, including the protest signs. I did a project in Harlem in 2017 at the Hunter East Harlem Gallery with Arden Sherman. And so in that project with residents of East Harlem, we would study protest imagery of protests that had happened in the past 100 years. And we had a public studio and we would recreate protest signs based off of the interests of the people who came in, right? So we would make a protest sign, or better yet, they would make a protest sign that maybe I'm like, here's the research I've amassed, here's, what are you interested in? Let me kind of link you up with some of the images that I have to do with your social justice interests. So they would create physical sculptures, essentially, of details of photographs that reflected their social justice interests. And so social justice imagery becomes really one wonderful and violent and impactful way to see like how images function. So that's also a problem because usually artists who do social justice work are like 100%, right? And their whole practice becomes about that. So there are times where I feel like there are maybe 3 or 4 Venn diagram spheres of the ways that I work, and that to me, like vision and visibility is sort of like the coalescing overlap. And I'm a really big believer in that when you kind of you step out of those realms in order to go back and to immerse yourself, and again, you need those sort of like destabilizing, you can benefit from destabilizing experiences, right? Like, and so this is very meta photo work, right? And that sometimes I think like work in social justice and visibility benefits from this kind of looking and vice versa. And it's like kind of a matter of faith, and also like what keeps you interested in, working hard. If you're working hard and you're not thinking about it, you're probably doing something right. You're going in the right direction.
Yeah, but what interested me in what you were saying about these posters was this kind of second order reiteration, in part from photographs of historical demonstrations, but reinterpreting or even mimicking the original protest signs as a kind of contemporary sculpture.
Yeah.
It's a sort of fascinating approach.
Well, and then once you make an image of it, or here's like what we did today, and you post it, and then it kind of becomes in a Google image search, right? Or, if depending on how you hashtag it. So then you're sort of like checkerboard creeping into, Google search results as an example, right? And so there's like a funny sort of tsunami of like what happened in the last week competing against what's happened in the last 2,000 years. And, you know, artists problematize that in an interesting way, I think, by just producing sort of informal and formal content that they're posting, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's weird. If you want to kind of have a conversation with any historical epoch, you just make some work and post it, and then it's like it's going to be in those. It's hypothetically like searchable,
yeah,
right? And so when
So it comes up alongside the original.
sometimes, yeah, or you know, or maybe you're like pushing down everything a level or two.
Yeah.
And so you have to be aware of like, oh, this is really like ridiculous, you know.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of that stuff like we don't quite I don't understand it yet. I'm just sort of, I think sometimes it's like to be messy and to just notice like, okay, here are the things that are happening. And, you know, history writing has changed like in the last 15 years more than it's changed like maybe the previous like few hundred.
Yeah.
I don't know, whatever, like very arguable.
Well, but that's interesting about this installation too, because you got this sort of flattening out of the historical moments into, you know, a kind of oddly contemporary narrative based on these, this mixture of historical artifacts.
Yeah. What's funny about this is like this doesn't photograph well. Even when we have like this nice gray that's kind of like just the nice kicker to like shift the ground figure relationship of this palette of old photos, right? And so this is something that we first did at SF MoMA. It was just like a nice way to just like give sort of like the tonal range a little bit more breathing room. But like work like this doesn't Instagram well. It's hard to document it. And it is sort of multi-focal points, like it does reward in-space viewing. And so I guess maybe thinking about the thing I like about working like this is that it's like extra new, there's no protection, like you could just walk away with elements really easy. You can't get good coverage of the installation unless, you know, like you had a really high-res image, but then you're like zooming in. It's just not fun and it's not immediate. And so there is kind of, right, like I carry this body around all day, every day. And so, you know, there's a lot of meaning making that happens in person and the physicality and, you know, having to like work up a ladder or get some help to get a ladder over to get up like near the ceiling and all those things that like still haven't gone away, you know, and the sort of brattiness of what it is to have, you know, something that has really small information, you have to get close, and that there's like these different points of view that don't flatten easily.
But the thing that's interesting, you know, both about that physical and even archaic model of looking at pictures is still about communication systems. And a lot of what you're talking about is what carries across communication systems and how you can broadcast that over whatever communicative system you're using. Right. Now, the last thing I wanted to ask you about, and then I'll ask for some questions, is the ultimate version of that, which is posting the number for the White House, which is the print that's up here. And so tell me how that came about and whether people have taken you up on that and whether there's feedback from people calling the White House for one.
Oh yeah, that's a great kind of like ending note. So I started with Trump's election. There was a spate of articles that came out about the White House phone number being disconnected, and it went through a number of stages where it was disconnected and then it was maybe connected to a website, but the website like link wasn't active, and then maybe it was, but you know, it was like a series of, I don't know, what felt like bureaucratic, like, oh, let's try this, or there's an article about that, so like let's readjust a little bit. And you know, obviously with 45, you know, the phone number being disconnected is like such a benign thing in the large scheme of things, but in a way that's what became so perfect about it, because I started to think about the like I do not really agitate by calling the phone number. That's like never really been my MO, but I started to think about this like little moment, right? The very first week of the administration, that like the phone number was just this funny gate that like an analog, like a certain activist crew or just like kind of like analog methodology. It was just sort of like a gate, right? And it's like, oh, it's closed, it's awkwardly opening, like people don't know how to operate the gate, and you're like, oh, shouldn't we cut them some slack? Like, who knows how to set up a phone bank or how does that work? And so I just started to think about the phone number, right, as like just this beautiful, like it's literally an active thing you can call, but it also became sort of a stand-in for all the sorts of resistance that we're just starting to be like, what do we do and what forms do we take? And again, with resistance, it's like, do we go and do the things that we normally do? How do we create new visuals, right? Like hashtag #MeToo, for example, is a great example of like the combination of images and text, like creating like a whole new paradigm shift, like Biden flummoxing, like trying to like Twitter video like his way out of like a new read on his, like his normal, MO. And so anyways, another kind of funny story is that the reporter who Trump made fun of at the New York Times, his disability is the same physical condition that I have, and it's like pretty rare. And so I was like, I don't know, also.
So what was your response to that whole incident?
I mean, it was like kind of, I don't know, it felt like, I was kind of excited to be linked, right? It's like, like it just is another reason to feel connected. And I never seen like this, like, which was.
You didn't feel attacked personally?
It's like an honor to be, it's just like, it makes like, we're all, but like to go back to the beginning of our conversation, it was like, that was the work I was making in grad school when I was filled with like exploring myself and what is it to try to be an artist, and I was like, no. So it's like nice to bring that in a very sideways way, but I don't want it to be about me. Like this is more about like Sara being a surrogate for all types of like this moment, right, of what it is to have a kind of regime and to like have speak back and forth, and what are the modes, and so I just started making those in the dark room. And I make them very fast, and I do sometimes developer stuff fix, sometimes I do it the wrong way, and I just try to pretend like I've been at many protests, and I make them as fast as like what I feel like I would maybe if we're getting people out, like thinking about the economy of protest, right? You can either spend a lot of time on a sign, but then you only have one sign, or you can rifle out a bunch and then give them to a bunch of people. And so, I don't know, it just felt like a lot of artists are just kind of also just responding and making as a form of thinking. And so they become also a way to like, I donate a lot of those works, as we are doing here, to raise causes, raise money for causes that are particularly important right now. And so it's kind of like monetizing it, like just being really kind of wonderfully like the poetic economy. There's like a money, like a donation economy, and just sort of being like, I don't know, I've seen a lot of photograms in my life, or thinking about like the Anna Atkins cyanotypes and like the first photo book, it's just like, I don't know, let's like do something different with the photogram. And, so for me, it's just a way to kind of think through some of these things. And I wasn't even sure how stable that was, but it's been actually really holding up in the window up there. So I've been pretty, because a lot of them aren't really fixed correctly,
Deliberately.
Yeah, I mean, it's like.
It's a provisional message.
It's, right, yeah. And like, of course, if some of them like are illegible, I've always wanted like my ideals to like do huge grids of them, because I feel like those, the material variability as in Rossiter's work, like, that's doing like aesthetic things, but it's also speaking to all sorts of, I don't know, discourse or broken discourse, right, or subsumation of discourse.
And so that's kind of just your little protest hashtag, or is there something that actually happens if you call that number?
Well, right now, I haven't called it for like probably 6 months, but I think it will say thank you for your call, and maybe like go to the website to
Go to Jason Lazarus's
no,
website.
no, but I also think like, I mean, sometimes I daydream just about like the 202, like, well, just if I did, you know, the area code, right? Thinking about our, you know, like how do you get in people's face? How do you break through the dialogue? You know, is it like having a particular tweet, or, you know, like what are the kind of text image strategies right now? So these are the things I think about, and that's, yeah, like those, I'll keep making those till the administration ends. And then they become like just another journalistic form, I guess, you know. Yeah.
And we should mention that 100% of the proceeds go to Planned Parenthood or the ACLU. Whoever purchases that work can choose which or share between the two institutions. All of the money from the sales of this goes to help sustain things that this administration is trying to destroy.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Thanks. Thank you so much for the time.
Any questions, comments, donations?
I have a question.
Yes, young lady in the front row.
Each of the artists that's interesting on the show talked about operating in a kind of sweet spot in history where they couldn't have made this work a decade earlier or a decade later. You know, Allison talked about this moment where photographers, a lot of amateur photographers had at-home photo studios, and now those people are taking those spaces back. Or people are buying houses where there used to be a photo studio, and they're finding old photo paper, and they're finding their way to her, they're finding their way on eBay. You know, Susan's Polaroids, probably in 10 more years, those won't yield images, right? I mean, that's accurate to say. You and I talked about this as well, that you felt like you were doing these projects in a kind of sweet spot, where maybe in 10 years that won't be possible, and 10 years ago. Can you talk a little bit about how this fits into this particular moment and how that's allowed you to do these projects?
For this project, or?
For this and for Too Hard to Keep.
Okay, yeah, well, I think Too Hard to Keep we talked about, right? That it's like anyone under the age of whatever, you know, blank they like do not have anything really physical to offer, and that's fine. Like, I've sort of enjoyed the river slowing down to a trickle, and then just keeping sort of like these digital roads open, you know. I'm not sure what I'm doing with those yet, or it seems like not that important to rebroadcast them yet, per se. And then with this project, I think, like, as an artist, you're trying to find, you know, some of these are I think like maybe the cheapest photo that is up on that wall is like 10 cents, and maybe the most expensive is $100 some, right? But as an artist, you're trying to like run off materials, right? So, you know, all vernacular photography that's bodily right now will go up in price out of pure just sort of, right, like supply and demand, or as Sontag says, like everything eventually just becomes, whatever its artful intent is also just like history becomes valuable just because it's like a historical relic, right? So it's almost like at a point, right, when is the artist intention and just it being like, oh, we just don't even have many Polaroids to ever have anyone look at, like to try to explain to our kids or whatever. So, I mean, I think artists, you know, are always like trying to find, you know, there's like the scrounging instinct, right? But it's not just financial, it's sort of like poetic surplus. It's like critical meaning surplus. And it's like, I don't know, or there's room for a lot of people to work this way. And, you know, other people do work in related ways to this. And, you know, it's just a whole other huge sort of methodology that I think there's like lots of room for other artists to take other cultural, ethnic, history writing strategies and, you know, process, like, and like, as you say, re-articulate those for, updated poetic inquiries or historical research, etc.
You talked about the THTK works, like you're not interested in the story behind them, you're just interested in the image. And in this case, I wonder if you're at all interested in the image or curious about what's on the other side.
Yeah, like rarely. I like to try to see it as the viewer will.
Yeah.
And, I think there's room for projects there was maybe a Christian Marclay project that happened many, many years ago of photographs of instruments or something, and they were all shown in reverse, so it was like the muted instrument or something like that. It was very Marclay gesture. And, right, I do feel like that's a rich, you're seeing sort of organizing principles that you can't, and I kind of thought about different smaller, narrower but deeper explorations with different subject matter. But to me, this is kind of the anti-typological approach has been the one I've been most interested in, because I think a lot of photo enthusiasts or collectors have an idiosyncratic drive and then they follow it very linearly. So I was very aware of that. Even studying the Beckers, any other good young photo student, you see the kind of beautiful possibility and also this sad sort of racist eugenic-y kind of aspects of photography too, right? There's beautiful things that happen and the most horrible things that happen with that sort of lawn mowing approach to going through information. So I kind of felt well, this is what I feel least algebraically beholden to, and that was maybe kind of the sweet spot, if you will, of the working with this methodology. And again, I think it was somebody said something at the right time. I needed to hear that someone early on was no, this is where it is in the bigger, more ranging installations. Brian, did you? I know I saw your hand up.
You sort of talked a little bit around what I was going to ask about, but so I'm not exactly sure now why I want to ask the question. Well, first of all, would you swear an affidavit that there's actually an image on the other side of all this little
Yeah. For sure. Yeah.
Because my question is a little bit about the role of the image in the work, and I'm going to testify here a little bit, but because I was fortunate enough to be here when you were putting the work in place, and there was one particular piece that you had on the table that we ended up having a fairly long conversation about. And after about 5 or so minutes, I said, well, I really want to see the other side now.
Yeah.
We
You
were
peaked.
conversation, and you're like, are you sure? I was like, yeah. And so you turned it over, and in truth, it was a disappointment. It was a much thinner experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay, so, in all honesty, that's the part I want to speed pass through in terms of the viewer. The first time I showed this work, I was like, oh, people are going to think that's really gimmicky. But I truly, once I had this kind of initial experience, which is on the didactic about looking through some of my family archive images and just having these sort of kind of epic beginnings alluded to on the backs of the images. I really, the way I go through in a flea market is not looking at the images. So, maybe if I'm just bored or I'm having trouble making a this or that decision, but I honestly feel there's just a whole sort of history of imaging, right? The re-articulation of landscape, the re-articulation of what is a portrait, right? All those genre images, whether it's a fine art image or vernacular, all of those are reimagined, right? Just it's ground zero again. And those texts are just a whole other visual field, and I kind of just want to get people past the like wanting, and I just just get them to like ease up on the sort of game show part,
Right.
and but like that's sort of right, and just slow that down, right? 'Cause there's so many different rewards on that and that other side.
Well, and the reward is really to the point, because what I was trying to get at is that the fact of the image, the existence of the image, to me was incredibly important in that moment, and is incredibly important in this work, and yet the image itself is not the payoff.
Yeah.
Right? And so, to the extent that this is all coming around to a question, I guess the question is, as you were kind of developing this body of work, was there an evolution? Was there a time where some were faced forward and some back? Was there a moment of revelation? How did you come to this place of going, I'm a photographer, photography is an images-based medium, but this is a body of work which lives in this kind of liminal space between image and non-image?
Well, I think like artists and especially photographers, because photography is like a very well-behaved medium. You and I were talking about this before. There's a lot of like white knuckling of history and methodologies that's I'm very aware of, and like self-critical, or it's like kind of an exercise I'm doing, like what are the possibilities here, to be honest, I was a little shy about this way of working at first, and there was other work I was doing, and I was teaching at the School of the Art Institute, and a curator who was at, like, there was a visiting artist, and they were like, oh, what are you working on? And I was like, had been in Europe and had been doing all this other work that I was really excited about, and I was like, oh, blah, blah, blah. I'm really excited about this, and she's like, oh, let's do a studio visit soon. And then I went through all this work, and it was Kate Bassard, who's now at the Princeton Art Museum. She was the one who, it was almost really random that I showed it. Like she was giving me good energy, and I was like, okay, I'm not just gonna slow down. And so I just think, I remember there are a lot of moments, and artists have this all the time, where you feel insecure, or you're like, is this ridiculous? Or you're like looking for your cohort sort of approval. And so like within under 2 years, like that was up in a museum, and like no artist gets, like that's so rare. So you're just like super thankful when it does happen. And then, there's other work that just is like flailing in the shadows or under your bed, like stuff that's too hard to show anybody, but what I've learned now is like at the time you're so insecure, and like I don't know, like later a lot of it, even if it seems disparate to some people, I kind of feel like there are some clear railroad rails, and if I feel them and I can write about them, and you just have faith in those few railroad rails that have gotten, I don't know, they've gotten you excited or reinvigorated your practice or your way that you view the world, like that you just, that's important for the artist to do, and you just have to have thick skin and, put yourself out there. It's all about sort of public vulnerability, and that's it, because trust me, we're all rushing through daily life and art, and I was at PS1 today, and, which was tremendous and really exciting, but you're just cruising through images and text all day, and it's a tall order to ask someone to slow down and like maybe entertain a whole way of thinking about like images work. So it's like you're also just waiting. Maybe that someone is just in that mindset, but also, I'm sure everyone in here has had this experience. Like, you don't have to understand or even like something when you first encounter it. Works can have like a 10 or even 20-year boomerang where you flip, right? Like I encountered work when I was young. I remember a Donald Judd stack. I'm like, I have no idea what this is, but it's very memorable. And, it had it took 20 or 30 years to even start to understand, what's art? What was this figure doing at this time? Why does this have value? why as a little kid did I respond not knowing any of that context, or that like that canon had been developed, and what is it bodily that maybe intrigued me? It didn't look like other art, or maybe in that particular collection at like the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. So it's also just having faith in that people are complex, and that they're the way that they think about work, it can like prick or affect them, and then once you've done that, you may never know, like that process can be a long time, that people will come around. You don't have to know it. Yeah. Right.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
That maybe you encounter these kinds of questions because you align yourself so closely with photography, but in me knowing you and working very closely with you, I find that photography is just sort of like a funnel from which you see yourself as an artist. And maybe that's what you started off, but now photography is just one part of your practice. That an image making is not really what you're doing. It's everything around the photograph that is what you're engaging with, in my experience, in my knowing of your work. That even when you have people come and pose for a group portrait where they identify themselves as artists and they go and they pose, they stand in front of a camera. That none of that is actually about the portrait. I mean, the portrait is beautiful, and great, but none of it's about it. Everything's about what happens that day in the park or on the steps, in Chicago. Like everything is about the experience.
Right.
The image making or whatever, I guess is what we're saying, is just a way of community organizing. Yeah.
It can be a community organizing tool. It can be just like a foil for something else to happen. And then like it's especially like think about all the people who have come together because of a photographic event, even if it's like, oh, I'm having my portrait made, or I don't know, performing class, performing identity, right? Like the kind of like human bodies that have moved from point A to point B to like go through that methodology.
So how do you get away from it? How do you stop becoming a photographer or linked to that?
I actually feel like it's sort of like about not fighting it, but just sort of, this is where all my training has come from. So I think the part is my best, challenge is to manifest as many like kind of wonderful, strange, interconnected realms so that younger photographers go through other kinds of risk taking that I can't even imagine yet, because a lot of us in the room, if you're like an artist or like interested in the visual arts, you just need like the person who like kind of flipped the methodology, right? And like, so every time, I think that's what's going like to PS1 today, MoMA, like advertise at MoMA PS1 is like, it's just about practicing being brave. Like, look at all these people who just like did this. I had no idea they would like be in PS1. It's such a platform, and like seeing Gina Beaver's hilarious paintings that are actually really related because they're super impasto built up paintings that are of a lot of Instagram memes, but their surfaces are insane and like coming out 3, 4, 5 inches. And so it's just like this complete circle about the way a makeup tutorial that's like made as an Instagram slideshow then comes out on a canvas, and reconnects with that whole. So, I just feel like the whole enterprise and even collecting was like, one could argue like a form of like meaning making, right? Is like you're just trying to follow your interests, and people. Boredom is good because you're like, okay, let's try something else.
Good.
Sorry, that was
thank
so long.
Thank you. No, that was perfect. That was perfect. Well, thank you for coming. Thank you, Jason.